In today's video, I'm going to talk about one of the absolute toughest parts of the novel writing process, and that is killing your darlings. If you are self-editing or self-revising, it can be really difficult to see for yourself which scenes in your book are not serving the broader storyline and should be cut. Because after all, you wrote those scenes and you wrote them for a reason, and you might be a little bit attached to them. In this video, I'm going to give you some go-to tips on scenes that you can most likely just go ahead and cut from your novel, and it will be better for it. I promise that cutting any of these is most likely going to have no negative impact to your story. So don't be afraid. If you find this type of content helpful and you're anywhere along the book writing journey, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. It would mean a lot to me. I talk all things book writing and publishing every single week. So first, I want to begin with a quick discussion of why it is so important for you to be ruthless and cut those extraneous scenes from your novel. The first reason is it ultimately improves the pacing. By not having extra fluff or extra scenes in there that really don't move the plot forward, the story is going to have a better cadence, it is going to progress much more smoothly, and ultimately deliver a better experience for the reader. The second reason is that it maintains the focus on the main storyline. So often these extraneous scenes will divert the reader's attention to something else that ultimately doesn't really matter in the end of the story, and you don't want to do that because you do want to keep that laser sharp focus on the progression of the main story. And lastly, cutting those extra scenes discourages skimming. So if a reader reaches a scene and can kind of sense that it's not going anywhere or it's probably not going to be important, they are likely going to just skim it, and no writer wants to hear that their book was skimmed by the reader. So this ensures that every scene is extremely purposeful, every scene is going to engage the reader, and there's not really going to be any opportunities for them to skim. So let's dive into the first scene that I want you to cut from your novel. That is the characters being en route anywhere. This could be them driving a car, taking a bus, taking a train, taking the subway, or going in an airplane to some type of destination. In the vast majority of cases, you can really just skip over that transit scene and immediately go to the characters arriving at that destination. I mean, think about the last time you were on a long plane ride or car ride. It probably was pretty stagnant and kind of boring. So if it's stagnant and boring in real life, it is likely not worth putting on the page because it's just going to be stagnant and boring to the reader as well. And too often these scenes of characters in transit feel like filler that ultimately really just delays the next event from happening once they arrive. So just cut it out and just get to their arrival. Now, the one exception here is if something dynamic and interesting and important actually happens while the characters are in transit. In that case, of course, you do want to keep the scene, but if nothing significant happens, even if, I would argue, you have a conversation that you feel is important in the transit scene, just move it to when they arrive at their destination. Why does it have to be on the plane or on the train? If it doesn't have to be, then just move it and cut that scene because it's boring to watch anyone go anywhere. The next scene I want you to cut from your novel is any vague dream sequence. Personally, this is kind of a pet peeve of mine, but I really don't like dream sequences in novels. To me, they're really just vague and disorienting, and ultimately really don't do anything for me as the reader. Now, you as the writer likely have some significance that you prescribe to the dream. You understand what it is meant to signify and what you meant metaphorically through the dream. But your reader probably isn't going to pick up on those things. And remember, your reader really is not likely to go back to the dream sequence after the closing events of the novel to really think, oh, let me unpack that, let me figure out what it meant. Ultimately, those scenes just take our attention away from the main storyline. They're distracting and disorienting, and ultimately not necessary. They can also kill any sense of suspense or tension or urgency that you have built in the main storyline, because you're suddenly taking us away from that and showing us this confusing dream sequence before getting back to it. So that can really interrupt the pacing and, again, hurt the reader's experience. The next scene that you can cut from your novel is any overly long sex scene. Unless you're writing erotica, those sex scenes really don't have to be so long and graphic and detailed. Ultimately, less is more with these scenes, because too many visual or graphic details can feel a little bit uncomfortable to read, and they can again be distracting. Ultimately, too many details can actually become very unsexy and diminish the whole point that you're trying to convey. And in the vast majority of cases, those sexy details really have absolutely no bearing on the rest of the plot, so you can really just take them out. What I recommend doing is teasing those acts of intimacy between the characters and then cutting the scene a little bit early so that the reader can then imagine what happens between them, and likely they will fill in the blanks for themselves, and that will ultimately make for a better reader experience than you really detailing every sexual act from beginning to end. The next scene that you want to cut from your novel is any small talk or banter between the characters. Small talk is painful in real life for many of us, and therefore it is also painful to read. Maybe you have two characters meeting up for coffee or dinner, and they talk about the weather and they make some small talk before they get into the meat of their conversation. In those cases, while that is pretty realistic for you to portray that small talk, just cut to the main meat of the conversation, because it is ultimately just filler that we really don't need. And banter works the same way. You can really establish two characters' dynamics with just a few lines. You don't really need to show pages and pages of flirtatious banter to establish that these characters are flirting with each other. Just give a little bit, and then that's quite enough, because banter can also get really, really tiring to read. Ultimately, cutting down these dialogue exchanges will tighten up the scenes and help the reader focus on what is actually important in the characters' conversations, because pretty much in no case is the small talk or the banter really the point you're trying to make with that conversation, or what the main takeaway is supposed to be for the reader. So just really pare it down or cut it out entirely and just have the characters say what you need them to say. The last scene that you want to cut from your novel are any static setting descriptions. So these are really more like passages than scenes, because when I think of a scene, I think of something I'm watching in a play. So I am seeing the actors moving about on the stage. And what's happening with these static setting descriptions is nothing is actually happening. There are likely no characters even in that scene, because you are just describing what a home looks like or what a neighborhood looks like, or your world building and explaining to the reader how the rules of your world operate, particularly in the sci-fi or fantasy genres. Your novel should really be a series of active, dynamic scenes where the characters are doing something, and any setting description should be integrated in those scenes. Try to avoid stepping out of any scene for a long period of time to just describe something, because that's ultimately boring to read, and again, you run the risk of the reader skimming through it and missing the details that you're trying to convey. We should always learn about the details of the setting in the context of the character's experience of that setting. So really try to ground every scene and every passage in some kind of action around a character. And remember, it can be something small and nuanced. It doesn't have to be a huge action scene or anything like that, but just connect us back to the character, because those long passages of setting description just aren't as effective. I hope these tips help you identify some unnecessary scenes in your novel and help you kill your darlings in the interest of creating a stronger, more dynamic, more engaging story. So let me know in the comments below if you find any scenes to cut in your own novel, or if you found something else that I didn't even mention in my video that you think is something that should be cut in most cases. If you're looking for some more tips on how to strengthen your novel, I recommend checking out my video on common plot mistakes that will similarly give you some tips on things to look out for in your own manuscript as you are revising. And if you found this video helpful, please hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. I would love to have you around to talk all things book writing and publishing. Thanks so much for watching, and happy writing.